Catherine Mills stared at the data scrolling across her screen in the dimly lit laboratory of the Lunar Defense Initiative. Her eyes widened as the numbers confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. She pushed back from her desk, her chair gliding smoothly across the low-gravity floor, and took a deep breath. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself. But the data didn't lie. The experiment had worked for the fifth time in a row. Her small fleet of test drones had successfully created a controlled disturbance in the solar wind patterns between Earth and Mars. She reached for her coffee mug, only to find it empty. It was her fourth cup today, but she hardly noticed. The discovery was too important. Her research showed that multiple energy sources, working together in precise patterns, could influence space weather. It wasn't just theory anymore. She had proof. The door to her lab slid open with a soft hiss. Peter Howard walked in, his military uniform neat as always, despite the late hour. As the initiative's chief military strategist, he had been following Catherine's research closely. "You called?" he asked, noticing her excited expression. "Found something interesting?" Catherine nodded, gesturing to the main display screen. "Look at these patterns. Our drone test today didn't just detect the solar wind changes. They created them. We can control space weather, Peter. Actually control it." Peter moved closer to the screen, his expression turning serious. "Show me everything." Catherine pulled up multiple graphs and simulations. She explained in simple terms how the drone's energy emissions, when properly synchronized, could create ripples in space weather patterns. These ripples could be shaped and directed, just like weather systems on Earth. "The key is the coordination," she explained, pointing to a diagram. "Single drones can't do much, but when we link multiple units together, the effect grows exponentially. Think of it like many small waves combining to form one massive wave." Peter's military mind immediately saw the potential. The Zorn Confederation had been pushing humanity back for months, their superior shields making their ships nearly invincible. But if they could control space weather, could this affect their shields? He asked. Catherine nodded slowly. "In theory, yes. Strong enough space weather disturbances could disrupt any energy-based defense system. But we'd need many more drones than what I used in my tests." "How many more?" "Hundreds, maybe thousands, working in perfect sync." She paused, then added, "But that's not the really interesting part. These effects could potentially be scaled up to affect entire sectors of space. We could create safe corridors for our ships while making other areas completely impassable." Peter walked to the window that overlooked the lunar surface. Earth hung in the black sky, a beautiful blue marble that humanity was desperately trying to protect. The Zorn Confederation had already taken 3 outer colony systems. Earth's forces were retreating everywhere, and morale was low. "We need to take this to Admiral Bennett," he said finally. "This could change everything." Catherine began gathering her data onto a secure drive. "The math is solid, but the Admiral will want proof. Real proof, not just laboratory tests." "Then we'll give her proof." Peter turned back from the window. "How quickly can you set up a larger demonstration?" "Give me 3 days to reconfigure more drones. We'll need at least 50 for a convincing show." The next 72 hours passed in a blur of activity. Catherine barely slept, working with her team to modify the defense drones with new energy emitters. The regular weapons stayed in place. This was still a military operation after all. But each drone now carried the specialized equipment needed for weather manipulation. On the morning of the demonstration, Catherine stood in the observation room with Peter, Admiral Bennett, and several other high-ranking officers. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the drone fleet hovering in formation above the lunar surface. Admiral Bennett checked her watch. "Okay, Dr. Mills, impress me." Catherine nodded to her assistant, who initiated the sequence. The drones moved into position, forming a complex 3-dimensional pattern in space. Energy readings began to spike on the monitoring equipment. "First, we'll create a controlled solar wind disturbance," Catherine explained, keeping her voice steady despite her nerves. Watch the particle density readings on the main screen. The drones pulsed with blue energy, their emissions perfectly synchronized. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the readings began to change. A visible wave of charged particles appeared on the detection equipment, growing stronger as the drones adjusted their output. "Now for the real demonstration," Catherine said, entering a new command sequence. The drone formation shifted, and the energy patterns changed. Suddenly, a visible distortion appeared in space between the drones. The solar wind began to curve around it, creating a clear, safe zone in the middle. "That's impossible," one of the officers whispered. "Not impossible," Catherine corrected. "Just very, very difficult. The drones are creating a controlled space weather pattern. We can maintain this effect for about 30 minutes with current power levels." Admiral Bennett stepped closer to the window, her expression intense. "And this could be used against Zorn shields?" "Yes," Peter answered before Catherine could speak. "Dr. Mills's calculations suggest that a large enough drone network could create weather disturbances powerful enough to disrupt their shield harmonics. We could also use it defensively, creating safe corridors for our ships through dangerous space weather." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, watching the drones maintain their energy pattern. Finally, she turned to face them. "Dr. Mills, what do you need to scale this up?" Catherine was ready for this question. She pulled up a detailed proposal on her tablet. "I need more drones, at least 1,000 to start. We'll need to modify our existing defense fleet with the new emitters. I'll also need a bigger research team and access to the quantum computing facility." "You'll have it," Admiral Bennett said without hesitation. "This project is now top priority. We're calling it Project Stormweaver." As the other officers began discussing logistics, Catherine felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. Her discovery would change the course of the war, but she couldn't help wondering about the consequences of controlling something as fundamental as space weather. Peter seemed to sense her concern. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, just thinking about responsibility. We're about to gain control over forces that affect entire star systems. That's not something to take lightly." "Better us than the Zorn," Peter replied. "At least we're trying to protect our home, not conquer others." Catherine nodded, but before she could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Red emergency lights flashed as an officer rushed into the observation room. "Admiral, we're detecting multiple Zorn ships entering the outer solar system. They're heading straight for Neptune's orbital defense stations." Admiral Bennett's face hardened. "How long until they reach the Neptune perimeter?" 6 hours at their current speed." The Admiral turned to Catherine and Peter. "It seems we're about to test Project Stormweaver sooner than planned. Dr. Mills, how many drones can you have ready in 6 hours?" Catherine quickly calculated in her head. "Maybe 200 with basic modifications. It won't be enough for a major weather event, but we might be able to create localized disturbances." "Make it happen," the Admiral ordered, "and pray it's enough to slow them down until reinforcements arrive." As Catherine rushed from the room with Peter, she realized that the true test of her discovery was about to begin. The next few hours would determine whether humanity had finally found a way to turn the tide of war, or if her breakthrough had come too late to make a difference. The fate of Earth might depend on how well a few hundred drones could control the weather in space. Catherine had never felt more pressure in her life, but she also knew she had never been more ready for a challenge. It was time to show the Zorn Confederation that they had underestimated human ingenuity for the last time. The next 6 hours in the Lunar Defense Initiative were the most intense of Catherine Mills' life. She and her team worked frantically to modify as many drones as possible before the Zorn fleet reached Neptune's defense perimeter. Their workshop became a blur of flying sparks, quick welds, and constant equipment tests. Chris Martinez, the lead engineer assigned to the project, worked alongside Catherine. His hands moved with practiced speed as he installed another energy emitter into a drone's framework. "That's drone number 198, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. 2 more to go. Admiral Lisa Bennett stood at the command center's main window, watching the modified drones launch one by one into lunar orbit. Each drone carried their hopes of survival. The Admiral's tablet beeped with constant updates about the approaching Zorn fleet. Status report. She called out to the room. Peter Howard checked the latest data. Zorn fleet is 4 hours from Neptune. They're moving in a standard attack formation. Looks like 15 capital ships with fighter escorts. Catherine looked up from her work. 200 drones won't be enough to create a major storm, but we might be able to disrupt their shield harmonics if we concentrate the effect in a small area. Then that's what we'll do, Admiral Bennett decided. She turned to face the room full of tired but determined workers. Listen up, everyone. What we do in the next few hours might determine the future of humanity. I need your absolute best. The final preparations moved quickly. Catherine and Chris finished the last 2 drones while Peter worked with the tactical team to plan the defense. They would only get one chance to surprise the Zorn with their new weapon. 3 hours later, Catherine stood in the command center, watching the tactical display. The modified drones were hiding behind Neptune's largest moon, Triton, waiting for the Zorn fleet to enter range. Regular defense forces had taken position around Neptune's orbital stations. Zorn fleet entering outer sensor range. An operator announced. They're launching fighters. Admiral Bennett nodded to Catherine. Dr. Mills, you have control of the Stormweaver drones. Make it count. Catherine sat at the control station, her fingers hovering over the interface. Chris stood behind her, ready to help if any drones malfunctioned. The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of equipment. Zorn fleet is in position, Peter reported. They're starting their attack run. Catherine took a deep breath and began the sequence they had practiced. The drones powered up their emitters, moving into the complex formation needed to affect space weather. On the main screen, energy readings began to spike. Enemy fighters are engaging our outer defense line, someone reported. First wave of Zorn capital ships is launching missiles. Now, Admiral Bennett ordered. Catherine activated the full drone network. 200 points of blue light emerged from behind Triton, quickly arranging themselves into a 3-dimensional web. Energy pulsed between the drones, creating ripples in the local space weather patterns. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The Zorn ships continued their advance, their shields glowing with their characteristic purple energy. Then the sensors detected the first changes. Solar wind patterns are shifting, Chris announced, watching the readings. The disturbance is growing stronger than our tests predicted. Something about Neptune's magnetic field is amplifying the effect. On the tactical display, they could see the space weather distortion expanding, catching the edge of the Zorn fleet. The first signs of shield disruption appeared as flickering purple lights across their hulls. It's working, Peter said, his voice tense with excitement. Their shield strength is dropping, ordering our defense forces to concentrate fire on the weakened areas. The battle that followed was unlike anything in human military history. The Stormweaver drones moved in complex patterns, creating pockets of disturbed space weather that the human ships used for cover while attacking the struggling Zorn vessels. Every time the enemy tried to regroup, Catherine would adjust the drone formation to create new disturbances. First Zorn capital ship is going down, an operator reported. The announcement was met with cheers from the command center staff. But the Zorn weren't defeated yet. Their ships began to adapt, adjusting their shield frequencies to resist the weather disturbances. Catherine watched as their purple shield stabilized. They're learning, she said, fingers flying over her console. We need to change tactics. She ordered the drones into a tighter formation, concentrating their effect into a smaller area. The space weather distortion became more intense, focused on just 3 Zorn ships. Their shields failed completely, allowing Neptune's defense stations to tear them apart with conventional weapons. The remaining Zorn ships are pulling back, Peter announced. They're retreating to the outer system. The command center erupted in celebration, but Admiral Bennett raised her hand for silence. Good work, everyone. But this isn't over. The Zorn will be back, and next time they'll be ready for our tricks. Dr. Mills, what do you need to expand Project Stormweaver? Catherine was already making calculations. The amplification effect from Neptune's magnetic field gives me some ideas. With the right modifications, we could create much stronger weather disturbances using fewer drones. But we need to act fast, before the Zorn develop countermeasures. Make it happen, the Admiral ordered. I'm giving you full access to our drone production facilities. I want 1,000 drones ready within 2 weeks. The next 14 days were a whirlwind of activity. The Lunar Defense Initiative transformed into a massive drone factory. Chris led the engineering teams in streamlining the modification process, while Catherine worked on improving the weather control algorithms. Peter brought concerning news on the 10th day. Our intelligence networks picked up Zorn communications. They're calling for reinforcements from their home systems. We estimate they'll have a fleet 3 times larger than before when they return. Catherine looked up from her workstation, where she had been studying magnetic field interactions. How long do we have? Maybe a month. They're being cautious now that they know about Stormweaver. She nodded, turning back to her work with renewed determination. Then we'll be ready for them. The new drone designs are twice as effective as the ones we used at Neptune. And I think I found a way to use Jupiter's magnetic field to create something they won't expect. As the days passed, the drone fleet grew. Each new unit was better than the last, incorporating lessons learned from the Neptune battle. Catherine spent hours in simulation rooms, practicing with the expanded drone network. The effects they could create now made their first experiments look like child's play. 2 weeks after the Neptune battle, Admiral Bennett called a meeting of the project leaders. The command center's main screen showed the current status of Project Stormweaver, over 900 drones completed, with more being finished every day. The Zorn will return soon, the Admiral said, looking at each person in turn. When they do, we need to show them that humanity isn't just fighting back. We're taking control of this war. Dr. Mills, are you ready? Catherine stood, displaying the latest simulation results. We're ready. With the current drone fleet, we can create controlled weather disturbances large enough to affect entire battle groups. More importantly, we can maintain these effects for hours instead of minutes. And if they try to adapt their shields again? Peter asked. They won't get the chance, Chris answered, pulling up technical specifications. The new emitters can change frequencies faster than any known shield system. Once we disrupt their shields, they stay disrupted. Admiral Bennett studied the data, then made her decision. Begin deploying the drones throughout the solar system. I want early warning networks around every planet and major colony. The next time the Zorn come, we'll show them why it was a mistake to underestimate human innovation. As Catherine left the meeting, she felt a mix of pride and concern. Project Stormweaver had grown beyond her initial discovery into humanity's best hope for survival. But she couldn't help wondering what other surprises space weather control might reveal. They were playing with forces that affected the very fabric of space, forces that might have consequences they hadn't yet imagined. The war was about to enter a new phase, and Catherine knew that both humanity and the Zorn would never be the same again. The warning came at midnight Earth time. Colonel Angela Wright was reviewing defense patterns in her office on Europa when the alert flashed across her screen. The Zorn fleet had returned, and it was bigger than anyone had expected. Status report, she demanded, rushing into Europa's command center. Long-range sensors detect over 50 Zorn capital ships, her tactical officer reported. They're spreading out across the outer system. Multiple attack groups heading for different targets. Angela opened a direct channel to Lunar Command. Admiral Bennett's face appeared on the main screen, looking as if she hadn't slept in days. Colonel, the Zorn commander, Yix Thor, is leading this assault personally, the Admiral said without preamble. He's trying to overwhelm our defenses by attacking everywhere at once. Are the Stormweaver drones in position? Yes, Admiral. We have 300 units in the Jupiter sector alone. Dr. Mills' new configurations are ready for deployment. Good. You have command of the Jupiter defense. Don't let them through. The screen went dark as Angela turned to face her crew. Battle stations. Activate the Stormweaver network. In space around Jupiter, hundreds of drones lit up with blue energy. They moved into complex formations, creating a web of interconnected energy fields. Catherine Mills had discovered that Jupiter's massive magnetic field could amplify their effects far beyond normal levels. The first Zorn battle group appeared exactly where Angela expected them. 15 capital ships with fighter escorts dropped out of faster-than-light travel, their purple shields already at maximum power. Their leader, Yxthor, had clearly studied the Neptune battle and wasn't taking any chances. They're launching fighters, someone reported. Multiple missile launches detected. Angela smiled grimly. Initiate Operation Thunderstorm. The Stormweaver drones pulsed with energy. Around Jupiter, space itself seemed to ripple as massive weather disturbances began to form. The drones created paths of safe space for human ships, while filling other areas with destructive solar wind patterns. On her tactical display, Angela watched as the Zorn fighters encountered the first weather barrier. Their engines flickered and died as the disturbed space overwhelmed their systems. The larger ships pushed forward, their shields straining against the artificial storm. They're trying to modify their shield frequencies, her science officer called out. Just like at Neptune. Not this time, Angela replied. She sent the signal to activate Catherine's latest innovation. The drones shifted formation, creating a cascading pattern of energy pulses. Each pulse hit the Zorn shields at a different frequency, never giving them time to adapt. Purple shields flickered and failed across the enemy fleet. Their primary shields are down. Secondary systems failing. Angela keyed her command channel. All defense platforms, open fire. Concentrate on their weapon systems. Europa's defense stations, hidden until now, revealed themselves. Energy beams and missiles struck the Zorn ships from multiple angles. Without their shields, the mighty vessels proved surprisingly vulnerable. But Yxthor hadn't become the Zorn's most feared commander by being predictable. His flagship suddenly accelerated, pushing through the storm toward Europa. Other ships followed, using the flagship's wake to shelter from the worst effects. They're making a run for the defense platforms, Angela realized. Adjust drone formation pattern delta. Create a funnel. The Stormweaver drones moved again, this time forming a narrow corridor of calm space surrounded by violent storms. It looked like a safe path to Europa. But Angela knew better. They're taking the bait, her tactical officer reported. Zorn fleet is entering the corridor. Angela watched the enemy ships move exactly where she wanted them. Close the trap. The drones at the rear of the formation powered up to maximum output, creating a wall of distorted space that blocked any retreat. At the same time, the drones along the corridor began to spiral inward, making the safe zone smaller and smaller. Yxthor realized the danger too late. His ships were packed together in the narrowing corridor, unable to turn around or spread out. Their weapons fired desperately at the drones, but for each one they destroyed, 2 more moved to fill the gap. Corridor is down to minimum width, the science officer announced. Energy readings are off the scale. Angela took a deep breath, collapsed the funnel. The drones executed their final movement. The corridor of calm space vanished, replaced by a concentrated storm of solar wind and magnetic distortion. Caught in the center, the Zorn ships had nowhere to go. On the main screen, Angela watched as mighty warships were torn apart by forces they couldn't fight. Yxthor's flagship lasted the longest, its enhanced shields holding out for almost a minute before failing. Then it too broke apart, adding its debris to the artificial storm. Enemy fleet is destroyed, her tactical officer reported, sounding almost shocked by how completely their trap had worked. No survivors detected. Angela opened a channel to Lunar Command. Admiral, the Jupiter sector is secure. Yxthor's battle group has been eliminated. Admiral Bennett's response was interrupted by new alerts. Multiple signals were coming in from across the solar system. The other Zorn attack groups were retreating, pulling back to the outer system after learning of their commander's defeat. "Well done, Colonel," the Admiral said when the channel cleared. Dr. Mills' new drone configurations exceeded all expectations. But stay alert. This war isn't over yet. In the hours that followed, reports came in from other sectors. The Stormweaver drones had performed perfectly everywhere they were deployed. Human casualties were minimal, while the Zorn had lost over 20 capital ships and countless fighters. Catherine Mills arrived on Europa the next day to study the battle data. Angela met her in the command center, where they reviewed the drone performance logs together. "The funnel tactic was brilliant," Catherine said, studying the replay. "I never considered using the weather effects to herd enemy ships like that." Angela nodded. "Your tools worked perfectly. The Zorn never had a chance once their shields failed. But they'll adapt. They always do." "Maybe," Catherine agreed. "But I've been working on something new. The Jupiter battle proved we can create stable weather patterns much larger than we thought possible. With enough drones, we might be able to affect entire sectors of space. You think the Zorn will give us time to build that many drones?" Catherine smiled. "They don't have a choice. The production facilities on Mars are working at full capacity. We'll have thousands of new drones ready within months." As if to answer her confidence, a message arrived from Earth. The United Earth government had just approved the expansion of Project Stormweaver. Resources were being diverted from other military projects to support the drone program. "It's not just about winning battles anymore," Catherine explained, reading the report. "We're changing the nature of space warfare itself. Whoever controls the weather patterns controls the space lanes." Angela looked out the window at Jupiter's swirling clouds. Somewhere out there, the debris of Ixthor's fleet was still spreading through the artificial storm they had created. The Zorn Confederation had thought their superior technology made them invincible. Instead, they had learned that humanity's greatest strength was finding new ways to use the forces of nature itself. "What's our next step?" Angela asked. Catherine's eyes showed a mixture of excitement and determination. "We go bigger. Much bigger. The Zorn thought they could push us back to Earth and keep us there. Instead, we're going to show them that humanity has earned its place among the stars." As they spoke, the Stormweaver drones continued their silent patrol of the Jupiter system, their blue energy pulses creating patterns in space that would have seemed like magic just months ago. The war was entering a new phase, and humanity was finally holding the upper hand. Fleet Commander Daniel Ross stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the massive drone carrier ships launch their cargo into space. Each carrier held 500 Stormweaver drones, and the fleet had 20 carriers. In just a few hours, 10,000 new drones would join the war effort. "Status report on the drone deployment," he called out to his crew. "All carriers report successful launches, sir," his operations officer responded. "The drones are forming up in their designated patterns. Dr. Mills' new control systems are working perfectly." Daniel nodded, remembering the briefing Catherine had given him last week. The new drones were far more advanced than the ones that had defeated Ixthor at Jupiter. These units could create effects that the original designers of Project Stormweaver had thought impossible. His communications officer suddenly straightened in her chair. "Sir, urgent message from the Titan outpost. They're detecting multiple Zorn fleets entering the system, much larger than anything we've seen before." "Show me," Daniel ordered. The main screen lit up with tactical data. The Zorn had finally returned, 3 months after their defeat at Jupiter, but this time they hadn't sent a mere battle group. This was a full invasion fleet. "Count over 200 capital ships," the tactical officer reported. "They're splitting into 5 separate fleet elements. Each one is larger than Ixthor's entire force." Daniel opened a channel to Catherine Mills, who was coordinating the drone operations from the science vessel nearby. "Doctor, looks like we get to test your new toys ahead of schedule." Catherine's face appeared on his screen. She looked tired but determined. The drone network is ready. We've mapped out the space weather patterns across the entire system. Are you sure you want to try the new configuration? The Zorn gave us no choice, Daniel replied. They're throwing everything they have at us. Time to show them everything we've got. He switched to the fleet-wide channel. All ships, battle stations. Execute Operation Maelstrom. The 10,000 new drones moved into position, their formation spanning an area larger than Earth's orbit. Unlike the tight clusters used in previous battles, this formation spread out in a complex three-dimensional web that covered vast distances of space. Zorn fleets approaching optimal range, the tactical officer announced. They're launching fighters. Detecting power spikes. They're charging weapons. Daniel took a deep breath. Dr. Mills, you have control of the drone network. Show us what they can do. Catherine's hands flew across her control panel. The drone network activated, but instead of creating local storm effects like before, the entire web pulsed with energy at once. Space itself seemed to shiver as the largest artificial weather pattern ever created began to form. Energy output is stable, Catherine reported, creating primary effect now. The space between the human and Zorn fleets began to change. Massive waves of distorted space-time rolled outward from the drone network. But unlike the simple disruption effects of earlier battles, these waves carried something new. By all the stars, Daniel whispered as he watched the tactical display. The drones weren't just creating storms anymore. They were bending the fabric of space itself. Artificial gravity wells appeared throughout the battle space, creating a maze of spatial distortions. Some areas of space compressed while others expanded. Solar winds twisted into complex patterns that no natural phenomenon could create. The Zorn fleet's advance faltered as they encountered the effects. Their ships, designed to handle normal space conditions, struggled against forces they had never encountered before. Several smaller vessels were caught in the gravity wells and crushed. Others found themselves stretched and torn apart by the expanding spaces between the distortions. They're trying to punch through Sector 7, the tactical officer reported. 30 ships moving in attack formation. Daniel nodded to Catherine on the screen. Time for Phase 2. Catherine activated the drone network's secondary systems. The gravity wells began to move, shifting position in carefully calculated patterns. At the same time, new distortions formed, creating corridors of twisted space that forced the Zorn ships to bunch together. Just like at Jupiter, Daniel said with a grim smile. But on a much bigger scale, the Zorn commanders realized too late that they had fallen into another trap. The gravity wells and spatial distortions herded their ships into killing zones where concentrated solar winds tore through their shields. Entire squadrons of fighters vanished into artificial black holes that the drones created and controlled. Enemy fleet is breaking up, the tactical officer announced. They're trying to retreat, but the spatial distortions are blocking their escape routes. Catherine's voice came over the command channel. Commander, we're detecting some unusual readings from the drone network. The combined effects are creating something we didn't expect. Daniel looked at the sensor data she sent him. The massive web of drones had created something entirely new. A stable wormhole had formed in the center of their formation. Can you control it? He asked. I think so, Catherine replied. The math suggests we could direct where it leads. We could create a shortcut through space itself. Before they could discuss the implications of this discovery, new alerts sounded across the bridge. The remaining Zorn ships had regrouped and were attempting one final desperate attack. They're on a direct course for our command ships, the tactical officer reported. Suicide run. Daniel turned to Catherine's image on his screen. Doctor, can you move that wormhole? She nodded, understanding his plan. Her fingers danced across her control panel as she redirected the drone network's energy output. The stable wormhole began to drift through space, directly into the path of the charging Zorn fleet. The enemy ships had no time to react. One by one, they vanished into the wormhole's maw. Sensors showed them emerging thousands of light-years away, in empty space far from any inhabited systems. Enemy fleet has been neutralized, the tactical officer reported. Remaining ships are in full retreat. As the battle ended, Daniel looked at the sensor readings with a mixture of awe and concern. In just one engagement, they had completely changed the rules of space warfare. The Stormweaver drones could now create gravity wells, manipulate spacetime, and even generate controlled wormholes. "Dr. Mills," he said, "I think we need to talk about what just happened. These new capabilities, they're beyond anything we imagined." Catherine nodded seriously. "The drone network has exceeded all our predictions. We're not just controlling weather anymore. We're reshaping space itself. The question is, are we ready for that kind of power?" Daniel looked out at the vast field of drones, their energy pulses creating patterns that defied natural law. "Ready or not, we have it. And something tells me we'll need every bit of it before this war is over." Reports began coming in from across the system. The Zorn's massive attack had been completely defeated. Over 100 of their ships had been destroyed or banished through the wormhole. Human casualties were minimal, mostly limited to a few drone carriers that had strayed too close to the spatial distortions. But even as they celebrated their victory, both Daniel and Catherine knew that this was just the beginning. The Zorn would return, and next time they would be desperate. The ability to control space itself was too powerful to ignore. "Begin collecting all the battle data," Daniel ordered his crew. "We need to understand exactly what happened out there today. And get me a secure channel to Admiral Bennett. She needs to know what these drones can really do now." As his crew carried out his orders, Daniel watched the drone network continuing its silent operation. They had started this project hoping to control space weather. Instead, they had gained the power to reshape the very universe itself. The war had entered a phase that no one could have predicted, and the fate of humanity would depend on how they used their newfound abilities. Admiral Lisa Bennett stood in the newly built Strategic Command Center on Mars, surrounded by holographic displays showing thousands of Stormweaver drones spreading across the Arcturus sector. After 6 months of preparation, Operation Thunderhead was ready to begin. "Status report," she called out to her staff. "Drone network is at 98% deployment." Catherine Mills responded from her station. She had been promoted to Director of Spatial Operations following the breakthrough at Titan. "All units are reporting optimal power levels." The Admiral nodded, studying the tactical display. Intelligence reports indicated that the entire remaining Zorn fleet was gathering for one final push. After losing hundreds of ships to the expanding Stormweaver network, the Zorn Confederation had decided to risk everything on a single massive attack. "How many enemy ships?" she asked. "Long-range sensors detect over 500 capital ships," Peter Howard reported. He had remained her chief strategist throughout the war. "They're gathering near the Arcturus system. Our predictions were right. They're planning to hit us with everything they have left." Lisa turned to Catherine. "Are you sure about this plan? We've never attempted anything on this scale before." Catherine's eyes showed both confidence and concern. "The simulations all worked. With 20,000 drones spread across the sector, we can create weather effects bigger than anything in recorded history. The real question is whether we can control them. Better to risk it than face that fleet in a conventional battle," Peter added. "Even with our regular Stormweaver tactics, we'd lose too many ships and stations." The Admiral made her decision. "Begin the operation. Alert all human ships and stations to move to their safe zones." Catherine's hands moved across her control panel, sending commands to the massive drone network. Across a space larger than 1,000 solar systems, blue energy began to pulse in complex patterns. The drones moved into their final positions, forming a web that would trap the entire Zorn fleet. "Enemy fleet is moving," Peter reported. "They're entering the outer edge of the drone network's range." "Start the primary sequence," Lisa ordered. Catherine activated the first phase of Operation Thunderhead. Instead of creating localized storms or gravity wells, The drones began generating a single, massive disturbance that covered the entire sector. Space itself seemed to ripple as artificial weather patterns formed on a scale never before seen. "Energy readings are off the charts," one of the science officers reported. "The effect is self-sustaining. Each distortion is feeding power back into the network." On the main display, they watched as the Zorn fleet encountered the first waves of distorted space. Their ships slowed, shields glowing, as they tried to push through the artificial storm. But this was different from anything they had faced before. "They're trying to retreat," Peter announced. "But the weather pattern has cut off their escape routes. The entire fleet is trapped in the effect zone." Catherine's voice was tense as she monitored the drone network. "Phase 1 is stable. Beginning Phase 2, initiating the gravity cascade." The drones pulsed with new energy. Throughout the affected space, thousands of small gravity wells began to form. Each one pulled at the Zorn ships, forcing them to use more power to maintain their positions. Their shields flickered as they tried to compensate for the multiple forces pulling them in different directions. "Their fleet is breaking up into smaller groups," Peter reported. "They're trying to find safe paths through the distortions." "There are no safe paths," Catherine said quietly. "Not anymore." She activated the final phase of the operation. The gravity wells began to move, drawing closer together. At the same time, the space weather distortions intensified. Solar winds twisted into impossible patterns, creating corridors of destructive force that no shield could withstand. The Zorn fleet found itself being herded into a series of killing zones. Ships that tried to escape were caught by moving gravity wells or torn apart by concentrated solar winds. Others were crushed as space itself compressed around them. "We're detecting massive power spikes in the drone network," a technician called out. "The combined effects are creating something new." Catherine studied the readings, her eyes widening. Multiple stable wormholes are forming throughout the sector. The gravity wells and weather patterns are tearing holes in space-time itself. They watched as Zorn ships vanished into the wormholes, emerging thousands of light-years away in random, empty regions of space. The once mighty fleet was being scattered across the galaxy, their formation torn apart by forces they couldn't fight or understand. "Incoming transmission," Peter announced suddenly. "It's from the Zorn command ship." Admiral Bennett straightened her uniform. "Put it through." A hologram appeared in the center of the command room, showing a tall, reptilian figure in an ornate uniform. The Zorn's Supreme Commander's scales had a dull gray color that indicated age and high rank. "This is Supreme Commander Kalthar of the Zorn Confederation," the alien said in a translated voice. "We request a cessation of hostilities." Lisa glanced at Catherine, who nodded. The drone network could maintain the sector-wide storm for hours if needed. "This is Admiral Lisa Bennett of the United Earth Government," she responded. "Are you offering surrender?" The Zorn commander's facial scales shifted in what they had learned was a sign of resignation. "We underestimated humanity's capability for innovation. Our forces are trapped or scattered. Continuing this war would only lead to more pointless destruction." "Wise decision," Lisa said. "Power down your weapons and shields. We'll provide safe corridors for your remaining ships to gather in neutral space. We can discuss terms there." After the transmission ended, the command center erupted in cheers. After years of fighting, the war was finally over. Humanity had not only survived, but had revolutionized space warfare itself. Catherine began the process of slowly powering down the drone network. The massive weather patterns and gravity wells gradually faded, leaving behind a changed sector of space. Some of the wormholes remained stable even after the drones stopped powering them, a discovery that would have huge implications for future space travel. "Begin recovery operations," Lisa ordered. "I want damage reports from all human stations and settlements, and get me a complete analysis of what just happened out there." As her staff carried out her orders, she walked over to Catherine's station. "That was something else, Doctor. I don't think anyone will try to push humanity around for a while." Catherine nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. We've changed everything, Admiral. The ability to control space weather and gravity on this scale, it gives us responsibility for forces that affect entire sectors of space. We'll need to be careful with this power. That's why I'm recommending you for the new Spatial Sciences Division. Lisa told her, we'll need your expertise to understand and control these capabilities properly. 2 weeks later, representatives from Earth and the Zorn Confederation met on a neutral station to sign the Arcturus Accords. The treaty not only guaranteed peace but also recognized humanity's right to expand through space. The Stormweaver technology would be regulated by a joint council, ensuring it would never be used for conquest. In the years that followed, the drone network was repurposed for peaceful uses. It created safe travel lanes through dangerous regions of space, controlled natural space weather that threatened colonies, and maintained stable wormholes that revolutionized interstellar travel. Catherine Mills stood in her new office in the Spatial Sciences Division, looking out at Mars' red surface. A group of Stormweaver drones passed overhead, their blue energy pulses now a common sight throughout human space. They had started this project hoping to defend Earth. Instead, they had gained the power to reshape the galaxy itself. Humanity's place among the stars was secure, not through conquest or aggression, but through innovation and the determination to survive. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would the people who had learned to control the very forces of space itself.